So welcome to another video from theplayersaid.com. My name's Alexander, and today we have another episode of From Cover to Cover. If you've been tracking this, it's been a couple of months since I've done one of these. Been in a bit of a reading slump over the past few months, but feel myself kind of getting back into things. But I wanted to talk about a book that I read a while back, just to kind of kickstart myself back into this series, because it's a book that I read that was very interesting and kind of noteworthy from what it is and what it's trying to be. But I had read this just before the inception of this series came to be, and just kind of wanted to put this one out there because I think this is something that's a little bit, I don't know, just something a little bit different. So today we are talking about a book called A Signaler's War, and this is the sketchbook diary of Private Ellis. And this particular book it's edited, and it's mostly, a lot of it is written by, with supporting text from a gentleman called David Langley. So, a couple things about this book. This is a book about World War I, and it is very explicitly about Lawrence Ellis, who was 17 years old when he signed up illegally to go and join the war, and this is his personal diary that he kept, but he was kind of like a budding sketch artist at the time, and so this is like a pictorial, a bunch of like his sketches and his notes from his accompanying notebook, and then they've been collated and put in chronological order with David Langley, who's like the kind of editor of this, his like supporting text, and he synthesizes a lot of the written diary. There's a lot of excerpts from it, but he also synthesizes things down, so you're not just reading someone else's notebook. Like, it puts a lot of things into some context. But then at the end of each chapter, there's like all the things, like all the entries from the notebook in the time that you've read through. Here's all the kind of sketches from that. They're both very illustrative and very enlightening and very interesting in their own little way. Now, this is not a traditional book. It is in like landscape format, and it's kind of big and a little bit unwieldy. And I bought this for, I believe, a maximum of £4. I think I paid £3 for it from the Tank Museum at Bovington. I enjoy the Tank Museum. We grew up near there. We went a whole bunch of times when I was a kid. It's a great museum. And they had a flash sale on, and like, it was £3 plus like not very much like peanuts shipping, because they shipped it very slowly because I don't want to pay for it, and all of that together, getting it to the US was still cheaper than if I'd have bought it off the shelf. So if I'd have been in the UK, I'd have paid £3 flat for it, and it would like, and so it was kind of like, okay, that's interesting as a concept, and for £3, what's the worst that could happen? And turns out this book, while it's not perfect, was just that. It was interesting. I enjoyed a lot of the very insightful and human moments from this book, because this book is, at least the original sketchbook of Private Ellis, who was in the Signal Corps, hence the name of the book. So he was the signals man, keeping the communications open between like command and artillery batteries. That's specifically what he was doing. And I think in the war, he just like, it was just kind of something that he did. And it wasn't until after the war, and then like 10 years after that, he did a couple different drafts of this to kind of like compile everything kind of for his kids so they could understand a bit more about what it was. And so in some of that, there is some of his biases and opinions that come into that. But that's all, because this is really just like a synthesis by a third party, all that stuff is kind of highlighted and explained, where he's like, hey, by the way, between these two editions that he wrote, there's some significant changes, and his opinion on his experience in the war changed and what came of it and things like that. So this is a neat book because it goes into some of those layers of what makes something a good historical source. But I found myself most of the time just wanting to read the original the original notebook text and see the images with their, descriptions and annotations. And that's, no offense to David Langley, it's because he's not a particularly artistic writer. It's very academic. A lot of it is, we're like, this happened and this is what he thought about it, and then here's the pictures at the end. The synthesis of all of the material isn't necessarily the most engaging. However, when you get to the material, I think the material is very engaging. I think it is very interesting. And Mr. Langley even talks about how, like, in preparation for this, there was like thousands and thousands of pages and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sketches. And he was like really honored to have like been given this by Ellis's family to turn into something. And he talks about how awesome all this huge body of work is and what that looked like, but we don't really get to see all of that in its glory. I don't know if I'd want to see a facsimile of that, but I think I would want to see more of a facsimile of that. You get all the pictures and stuff, but then there's also just like pages of his like, by the way, so like there's all the pictures, and then when you get into the next chapter, it's like, here's all the text of like what is coming up in the next few pages of pictures. And it flip-flops between being really interesting and like less engaging. This book, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of this. I think I know one person that has it on their Goodreads, and that's not a good measure to go by. But I think when I read this, I was one of 3 people in the world who had this on a shelf, and subsequently one of our patrons has it on their shelf as well. So like, as of recording this, 4 people have this on a shelf. And this is consistently every year, like, that book that is the least shelved, because no one's ever heard of this, because, I mean, how do you even come by this, right? But again, it's a mixed bag, because there are some parts in this book which make it worth £3 very easily. Some of the stuff that he goes through and the journey of his war, very, very interesting. And again, you get that in a totally different way, and I do think it's very interesting. Maybe I'll talk about those one day. Is in Spike Milligan's autobiographies of his war diaries, he was a signalman in the artillery during World War II. So these 2 gentlemen that have books, very different styles, but like they were doing a very similar type of thing, only about 30 years apart. Maybe a little bit more, 35 years apart. And it's just fascinating having read both of those, where I'm like, I kind of know what he's talking about and why he was doing certain things and where, even though this was like, decades before, the doctrine for communications wasn't too dissimilar, where it was, getting to different posts, going out under fire, repairing wires. Those 2 things both happened, and these separately, again, decades apart in 2 different wars. Just think it's very interesting that those kind of things came up. But the journey of Ellis's war and some of the very specific moments, and if you ever read this, you're probably going to know what I'm talking about. Towards the end of the book, there's some fairly harrowing things that happened, and it's watching this person whose drawings aren't going to get you in a museum. Some of them are quite naive at times, but some of them are incredibly detailed. And you can kind of see the difference between some of those things, or because he's an amateur artist, you can tell in a picture what the focus was on. And you're like, that's the part of that stood out to him. That's the part that he remembers, that is burned into his memory, and the rest of it might be a background. Or you have something where it's like, this is a picture of rain that happens to have soldiers and trenches in it as well, right? And so, looking through from an artistic standpoint, from a pictorial standpoint, it's fascinating to see, in more than just words, like, what this person experienced, and for you to be able to glean the kinds of things that stood out to him as that were most important in those moments. I think that so partly I do recommend this, as it's very interesting from that standpoint, but it's a bit rough around the edges, and if you get it for £3, why not? It is kind of what I would say. But if you're in the US, I don't know if you're gonna hunt this thing down for anywhere close to full price. I don't even know if you could even find it anywhere. But so that it was an interesting book. It wasn't a perfect book, but it had some really good moments in it as well. But some of it was a bit of a slog, is what I would say, which is appropriate. But again, that only stems from the writing style of the editor, which is not my favorite. So, a couple games that might go in conjunction with this book, or that you might play as a result of having read this book. It's difficult because him being in the Signal Corps, you don't usually have that kind of thing in games. It's rare that you're going to have like communications and that kind of stuff physically on the board that you'll act out in games. And so I don't have a ton of like specific stuff to this. He also talks about obviously the Battle of the Somme is a big part of this, kind of in the little book. And I realised I don't know if I have any Somme games, but also why would there be any? It was I don't know. Just no. That I don't know if that makes a good game in any meaningful way. However, what I do have is Artillery Assault, which is Volume 3 of the Red Poppies campaigns from Compass Games. Now, hopefully this is still available. There's the titles in this series can be sometimes quite difficult to get. But specifically I want to talk about Artillery Assault. Some of the other games, I haven't played the first one, which is the Battle of Ypres, but that sounds like it would be very appropriate, because in that one it's 3 games using the same geographical area, but it's degraded over time for 3 different battles at the same area that like got destroyed, and it like physically changes from all the artillery damage and stuff like that. So I just don't happen to have that. But that would reflect very well as to what's in the book, because at the beginning and towards the end, he revisits exactly the same battlefield and exactly the same trenches that he was posted to, a couple of years before, and his thoughts about that are very interesting. But what I do have is Assault Artillery. So, Assault Artillery, again, you don't have the Signal Corps in this explicitly, but the artillery rules in this, as you may well imagine from the title, are very intense. So this is great because it's this massive assault. You as the French forces going over the top to try and tackle the German lines, and you have tanks, and you have artillery rules to do all sorts of different things, and it is going over the top, and it is trying to make progress. And the map is just pasted in all these multi-hex deep trenches and barbed wire, and it's really, really, really interesting as a game. One of the most interesting parts, and it was kind of iconic, I think it's a hallmark of this, is we were literally performing a walking barrage. And that is only made possible by doctrine and by people in the Signal Corps. So that's kind of why I put this in here. Because the artillery rules in this are fascinating. Like, you have your little rows of guys in their trenches, and you got your tanks in support. But before, the beginning of every round, the first few rounds, you will, you have artillery that goes off in this line of hexes, and it just chews the Germans up. And then you're going to move up into that space, and then next round, you're going to do another, a bit further out, we're going to do another one, and then we're going to move up into that, and again, and you are making progress behind this walking barrage of artillery, and doing that and coordinating that was fascinating from a game standpoint. This is a big game. It's 2 maps. It is a long game because you're playing the whole thing. So you can play this for a long time. But more than a lot of other World War I games, I felt that there was a significant focus on the tactical aspects of artillery. A lot of, big the big grand strategic World War One games. It's like, hey, I have an artillery counter that gives me +1 to a die roll. Or like, oh, I researched heavy guns before you did, so I have artillery advantage. Cool, I get like +1 in combat or whatever. Whereas this, the artillery rules are tactical in their implementation, and it feels like what you would expect it to, at least in a game standpoint. So I really appreciated this for what it was doing, re-artillery. The other one that I'm going to talk about today is Paths of Glory. Paths of Glory we've only dabbled in, but Paths of Glory is the complete opposite end of the spectrum to what this book shows. But I do think that that's something that is both interesting to explore and also kind of important to consider. So, Paths of Glory is like the entirety of like the Western Front of World War One, basically. It's the Eastern Front as well, but this is like Central Europe. You're very traditional. Here's your British and French defending over here. Here's your Russians, and it's a bit more chaotic, and then they have a revolution, and then there's the Balkans, which can be a little bit messy. And then the Italians obviously kind of joined in at some point. This is all of that in a game. This is very detailed. This is quite a heavy game. If you've never played any war games, this is put your big boy pants on. But it's excellent from what we've gleaned from it so far. This will be revisited at some point, where we'll do kind of some of the whole hog. It's mostly a time and space thing at the moment, but this is a game that's never going to leave my collection, because what we experienced it was so good that I want to see more of that. But why would I recommend this in relation to this book? Well, I'll be honest, a lot of World War I games are at this scale. There's a game called Lamps Are Going Out. The second edition of that is incredible. Grant has it at his house. I just don't happen to have it. Otherwise, maybe I'd talk about that as well. This one, Imperial Tide from Compass Games. Again, I think Grant has that one. I don't think I have that. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's at his house. Even An Attrition of Souls, which was less deep, was my favorite, but it's a lot of those like quite famous World War I games are at this scale, where it's the whole of Europe and you fight the whole war. There's just not as many games on World War I kind of battles or tactical games that are as famous. I have a couple. I've got Rock of the Marne. I've got Great War Commander. And I think I have Breakthrough Cambrai, which is a tank battle game at the end of the war. So like there are some, and we've played little small ones. A lot of them are to do with like the disaster at Ypres. Like I've got Death of an Army. There's Nach Paris from VUCA Simulations. There's more out there, but I feel like they're less kind of famous and less well beloved. So I think for a lot of people, it might seem like there's not as many. It's harder to kind of get to. But, so I wanted to highlight one that's, a lot of World War I games look something like this, where it's the whole war. This is excellent from what we've experienced so far. And what you get in this is the whole war, the highs and the lows, the static warfare, all the maneuver warfare, the chaos and the turmoil. And you have that in a microcosm in this book as well. Ellis's experiences are so wide-ranging, from like great bravery and camaraderie to like, horror and loneliness to, spoiler alert, getting wounded and recovery and what that's like, being moved to a different unit, what that's like, the kind of the fierce nature of being in a battle, the lack of control that you have of the overall situation based on your little tactical situation. All of those highs and lows, you have in a microcosm of one man's experience. And I think seeing these two types of experiences next to each other, I think is worth doing. I like that in any war game, being able to see from a tiny singular perspective and also a grander perspective. It helps you to bring those two together and get more of our kind of, sadly, some of our worst human experiences out of it, but also some of our best as well. I just think that's an interesting exercise. So those are the two kind of games that I'm putting up alongside this. Again, it's tough to find games, at least that I've played, that have such a heavy emphasis on maybe the command and control aspects of it, because that's really what was going on here. You know, relaying messages and getting, you know, phone wires together and holding them together during a barrage. It just kind of nuts stuff like that that's going on. It's tough to get that in a game, so I wanted to highlight these two games. There's plenty more out there. There's lots more for us to explore for World War I games, and it's a topic that I'm very interested in as well. So if you have any good recommendations for World War I games, let me know. Especially if you can get like tactical ones. Again, I've got Great War Commander on the shelf. One day I will play it. I've got Verdun Steel Inferno 1916 from Fellowship of Simulations, I think is who it's by. Looks really good, comes very highly recommended. Just haven't got there yet. But yeah, let me know what you think. If you've read this, let me know, because I don't think anyone has. But I would be very happy to see if anyone had. And frankly, I bought it for like £3 or £4. Supported one of my favourite museums and charitable institutions, which is the Tank Museum of Arlington. So a big shout out to them. I watch all their videos on YouTube. But appreciate you very much for tuning in. I've been Alexander from theplayersaid.com.